Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, Economics Explained. It came out 7 hours ago, so I'm not going to post it today. Maybe tomorrow or the next day, though. I know that Washington, D.C. it has a lot of, poor areas, but it's really small, and yet it has the highest average income it's not a state, but if it were a state, it would have the highest average income of any state, which is crazy. And clearly the politicians pay themselves well.
A federal district that is the capital city of the largest and most powerful economy to have ever existed. Hopefully everybody watching already knew that, but what is interesting is that this special zone, which is not quite a city, not quite a state, and not quite a municipality, is home to technically one of the most productive and complex local economies in the world. Despite being significantly larger and significantly more populous, it has a higher GDP per capita than even Monaco, which is essentially a nation dedicated to super yacht parking.
Okay, I was going to guess like 103,000. Jesus Christ.
And a casino floor. Despite this though, DC and all of its strange technicalities are technically more productive. So what's going on here? The economics of this whole city are really interesting for some important reasons, not least of which is that alongside being the wealthiest distinct economy on the planet, it might also be one of the most unequal. What's more is that almost inevitably calls for this special region to become its own independent state are going to get more intense in the years to come, and it's important to understand what that would mean. And even if some of these headline economic figures are technicalities, let's be honest, technicalities are fun and they...
But then you have the seat of the U.S. government as its own state, which is a little crazy. I haven't thought about it enough to really give my full opinion on whether it should be a state or not. I don't have enough knowledge on it, and I haven't thought about it enough to be, give a hard opinion.
They can teach us a lot about how these measures work and their limitations in telling a complete story. So, what is it that makes Washington, D.C. the most productive economy in the world? What would happen to this economy if it became an independent state? And finally, how has this wealth created such extreme inequality? Once we have done all of that, we can put Washington, D.C. on the Economics Explained leaderboard to see how it stacks up against US states and entire national economies. Have you ever felt like the internet is putting up...
I would really like to see a map of poverty that includes the adjacent parts of Maryland and Virginia, because that's where Washington, D.C. sits between. And I wonder if the poverty is similar to the surrounding areas in Maryland and Virginia. It's just that because it's the seat of government, that's why... the average income increases. It'd be really concerning, not that it's already not concerning enough, but if the surrounding areas that it touches in Maryland and Virginia aren't as poor in the poor areas as the poor areas in DC. I hope that made sense.
Roadblocks based on your location, prices shifting, websites blocked, unavailable content. It's frustrating when all you want to do is watch your favorite show while on vacation, only to be blocked from doing so. That's where Surfshark VPN comes in, today's sponsor. They make your internet experience smoother by letting you access websites as if you were anywhere in the world. So, say you're traveling or living somewhere with restricted content, just switch your virtual location and you're back to watching, reading, or working without the frustration. Now you're...
Guys, if you're interested in this, as with all the videos I watch that have sponsors, original link, top description, make sure to use their promo codes and links.
Binge watch your shows from anywhere in the world. It's like getting a free pass to bypass all the regional restrictions and pricing traps. Surfshark doesn't just open doors, it also locks them, by protecting your data from hackers and keeping your online activity private, even on sketchy public Wi-Fi networks. It's a simple tool that gives you more control over the way you use your internet without
I'm tempted
all the
to go get coffee right now.
If that sounds good, head to surfshark.com/economics or click the link in the description to get an extra 4 months for free. With a 30-day money-back guarantee, there's zero risk in trying it out. George Washington made the executive decision to place the new nation's capital along the Potomac River, sandwiched between Virginia and Maryland, with a maximum boundary of just 10 square miles. He died a year before the city held its first congressional meeting after the government formally moved from Philadelphia, although as a consolation prize, the new capital was named in his honor. The Constitution has made this location a federal entity, stripped of the conventional rights afforded to...
I think New York City was the capital when Washington was
country
president.
states,
Not
and
even
made this
Philadelphia.
location a federal entity stripped of the conventional rights afforded to the country states, an issue that continues to cause problems for the city and its supposedly wealthy residents. Washington is of course home to a lot of high-end government programs acting as a hub to nationwide departments that use DC for their headquarters. The FBI, ATF, EPA and many others use DC as their home base, albeit with the exception that these agencies have major offices all over the United States. The important thing is that leadership stays near the capital, and that's been the primary federal objective since the country was founded. And being the host to all of these major seats of power where federal decision making gets made, there are a lot of resources pumped into the city by industry groups, non-profits, citizens' bodies and even foreign governments to have some semblance of leverage in this legislative process. Companies like Capital One, Marriott, Amtrak and IBM have all chosen DC as their HQ, understanding that the closer to the lawmaking they are, the more control they have over their respective financial futures. Of course, this is where legal firms and lobbying firms come into play, which could include donations to whips and other influential members of Congress, or getting someone or a group close to these figures to do all the talking for them. In 2023 alone, social media companies like Facebook, TikTok, X or Twitter, Snapchat and Discord dumped a combined total of $30 million into the hands of 142 lobbyists to influence federal regulations. There's also a lot of money that gets pushed into the small city.
That's weird. I'm kind of pessimistic when it comes to human beings and government. I don't think there's been a single uncorrupt government in the history of mankind, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean some governments can't be less corrupt than others. But when you phrase it that lobbying, doesn't this just mean that if you're wealthy enough or your business is wealthy enough, then you can pay for, you can quite literally pay to influence laws, as he just said, and that just seems not okay.
To influence federal regulations. There's also a lot of money that gets pushed into the small city directly from foreign governments. In fact, foreign lobbying takes place in DC all the time in an effort to curb or push policy for their own international objectives, and with it, a vast amount of money. Now this obviously doesn't sound great, but it isn't necessarily always underhanded. There are dozens of embassies set up in the capital with the clear objective of coordinating on foreign policy issues that all openly want to advance their own country's prosperity by being present in a city that governs the most geopolitically influential nation in the world.
Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that. Yeah, that just makes sense.
Now, this isn't a geopolitical discussion or even an ethical debate over the role of money in politics. The point here is that within this city, there is a lot of cash in circulation, and the presence of these companies, federal agencies, and embassies produces lots of spending and lots of local jobs. Now, it's not all just politicking either. The network around DC has produced a lot of added value in the realm of R&D, and that can clearly be seen when looking at how concentrated this funding is on a map of the US. On paper, it also looks like the tech industry is absolutely thriving, employing just under 500,000 people with pay usually exceeding six figures. Now, the particularly astute or cynical amongst you watching might have noticed that that means that there are almost as many people working in tech as the entire population of the district, but this will all make sense soon. As recently as 2018, federal funding amounting to $4.64 billion went to research and development expenditures in the District of Columbia, with much of it going to medicine and energy. On the other hand, a lot of it goes into defense spending, and Uncle Sam has never been shy about this priority. Currently, DC is home to 400 international associations and about 1,000 internationally owned companies, 15 of which belong on the Fortune 500 list. It doesn't matter if it's a non-profit, pharmaceuticals, tech or military contractors. If a major company or country is influenced by the decisions being made in DC, odds are they have significant operations there. Also, being arguably the most famous capital city in the world, millions of people come to visit DC as a popular tourist destination, making it an industry that, even after the pandemic, continues.
I feel like London and Paris and Tokyo are more well known than DC. Am I wrong?
Used to be DC as a popular tourist destination, making it an industry that, even after the pandemic, continues to be one of their primary contributors to GDP. With the Smithsonian museums, art galleries and monuments like the Lincoln Memorial, all iconic in cinema and TV, it's managed to employ thousands of people and rebound dramatically after the pandemic, faster than many other major global hotspots. All of this sounds impressive, and it is. It genuinely creates a lot of high-end jobs that add lots of value in highly technical industries. However, there's more to the DC success story than meets the eye. While technically not a state, if it were one, DC would leave every one of its neighbors.
So what I'm getting so far, and what's different from my original thoughts, is that, you know, when I saw the GDP per capita and I know about the wealth unequal distribution in DC. I figured, my mind went to, okay, are government officials just being paid a ridiculous amount, and that's what's padding the GDP per capita there. But it seems like because of it's an area that people are more willing, people and companies are more willing to invest in, because it's an area where it's important to have, feet on the ground and close to people that influence laws, that transfers to higher wages for those working for the company there. That's my best sort of
in the
summary
dust in
so
terms
far.
of GDP per capita, but GDP is not necessarily a measure of how rich a place is. It's a measure of how much it produces. It's normally calculated using consumption metrics by adding up consumer spending plus government spending plus investment plus net exports. But it's still a measure of productivity. The reason that economists measure consumption instead of production is that putting an economist at the end of every production line or monitoring every service provided in an economy is impossible. It's much easier to look at consumption, because for something to be consumed, it had to be produced in the first place, and things like sales taxes and accounting keep track of consumption much more easily than production.
Makes sense.
And even then, this is not necessarily a perfect tool for measuring prosperity, as GDP figures are often subject to adjustments after initial calculations. A non-discrete economy makes this extremely challenging to discern, especially something like a state where there are no official controls over goods being exported and imported over state borders like there are with national borders. But even with these very real limitations, all other things being equal, having a higher income normally makes someone richer than someone with a lower income, but there are factors like debt, depreciating assets, and even how expensive it is where they live that can make the translation between income and wealth far from a clear one-to-one. Likewise, an economy with a higher GDP per capita is normally going to be wealthier than one with a lower GDP.
Like having $2 million to spend on a house in LA will get you a very different house, smaller, than say you had $2 million to spend on a property in Montana or Alaska or Wyoming or something. So makes sense.
Per capita, otherwise an economy with a higher GDP per capita is normally going to be wealthier than one with a lower GDP per capita, but especially when looking at extreme outliers like Washington DC, it's important to keep these limitations in mind. And the on-paper success of Washington DC can really be summed up in two words: they're cheating. The US capital city is one of the most desirable locations for the most powerful individuals and businesses in the world, and this has had a heavy impact on those regular people within the actual city boundary or just outside of it. During the 2023 fiscal year, the number of passengers transported to and from the city's borders, according to the Transport Authority network, amounted to approximately 231 million. A huge number, but one that's still not even fully recovered from its hit during COVID. This means that many of the people producing value in the district aren't being counted in its population, radically skewing GDP per capita metrics, and this makes economists' jobs difficult when trying to figure out how a state or country like this one's GDP should be interpreted. We've covered this already in our video on Luxembourg.
Residency? If you have a residence within the city?
Another economy with an almost inexplicably high GDP, so we don't want to repeat too much here, but the basic maths is this. GDP per capita is calculated by taking total economic output and dividing it by the population. If people come into the city to contribute to economic output, but then leave at the end of the day, they've contributed to the numerator up here, but they don't get counted in the denominator down here, making the resulting number bigger. While
Yeah, that's why I'm saying, couldn't you just count living residents?
GDP per capita can be reliable in most cases. This sometimes vulnerable metric makes people on the outside...
In fact, I wouldn't have even thought you would be counted. I assumed, maybe it was stupid of me, that the GDP per capita is counted by the citizens who live in the state. But if you live in the state but work outside of the state, then your GDP is counted towards the state that you work in rather than you live, and vice versa?
Assume that places like these...
That seems odd.
In most cases, this sometimes vulnerable metric makes people on the outside assume that places like DC and Luxembourg are way more productive than they really are. In the case of DC, this can get taken to a pretty hilarious extreme when looking at the Mall, DC's original suburb, that only takes about 1.5 hours to traverse on foot. It's packed with several thousand technical employees, greets about 25 million tourists every year, and brings in billions of dollars in economic activity. But it is technically only home to two people at the moment, President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill, Jill Biden. It rakes in almost $30 billion divided by 2 people, meaning that if this single suburb was its own entity, it would be several million times more productive than most national economies. Now obviously this is a silly example, but it is what's happening to a lesser extent with the rest of the district. What all of this means when looking at a map of this 10 square mile district, which has since shrunk with some land being returned to Virginia, is that the local economy really extends well beyond the presented border when it comes to the metrics it uses to report its wealth that when looking at the internal structure of DC itself doesn't really benefit anyone. And this has a lot to do with how Washington DC is structured. Even though it's home to the highest office in the land, DC is denied full control over its own budget. The district is not a state, it's technically not located within one, and yet it's expected to manage many programs that a state normally would, while also having less autonomy than expected. Most of the ultimate power, which traditionally would be given to states, falls into the hands of the US Congress. If the mayor of DC, who was also originally chosen by Congress, were to sign anything into law, Congress could come in and reject it within a span of 30 days, and they also hold the authority over a good chunk of its budget. This might seem like something symbolic or something that doesn't happen often, but Congress takes advantage of this function whenever the majority doesn't approve of certain policies. What is symbolic are the gestures Congress has given to the district in response to a regional outcry for representation, with token offerings like the District of Columbia Delegate Act, which basically just allows residents to elect someone who can sit on the House floor without any power to vote on policy. There's a chance all the aforementioned handicaps wouldn't be much of an issue if this piece of land was just a government outpost dedicated entirely to policymaking and management.
But it has
this
people
compact
in
city
it too.
now has almost 700,000 official residents, with many impacted without even being part of DC to begin with. People working everyday jobs that aren't represented in a way that would allow them to control their political or financial futures, something that, regardless of where one stands on this issue, is bound to breed massive amounts of disparity.
So why not just make every non-governmental area within DC part of Maryland, rather than making the seat of the government in the country within a state, which gives too much power in a way and too much responsibility in a way to the governing state of DC, or if DC were to become a state. So that's the issue. But I also see the issue with the fact that you have people in it so why not just separate it? Like make DC, the residential area, part of Maryland.
This is where the increasingly serious economic issues surface. Again, if DC were to be its own state, despite all of its paper wealth, it would have one of the highest poverty rates in the country. And although this has recently started to drop, it's not exactly ideal in a region that advertises itself as a landmark for the country built on equally distributed opportunities for all. From life expectancy to average income per household, there is a stark contrast to be found when comparing the wealthiest residents with minority groups specifically, most of which live at or below the poverty line. And here's the thing, the aforementioned metrics that skew Washington's per capita GDP have a darker impact as well when it comes to representing regional inequality. This is because when talking about wealth disparity in DC, it should apply to those commuting to the district to work as much as it does the residents. Strange economic technicalities make DC look richer than it really is, but they also make it look more equal than it really is, even if the figure is because when talking about wealth disparity in DC, it should apply to those commuting to the district to work as much as it does the residents.
Why?
Strange economic technicalities make DC look richer than it really is, but they also make it look more equal than it really is, even if the figures aren't exactly flattering to begin with. Where people work is usually where they receive their benefits, and these benefits are determined by a system that's totally out of their control. Of course, this means the situation is far more bleak, as it can't be noted as easily with the poorer workers living across the border. And it's not like policies couldn't be made to curb this mounting concern. In Montgomery County, Maryland, unemployment rates were relatively low and almost identical, indicating that various pieces of legislation could be presented to give opportunities for everyone working within DC, as well as the surrounding areas impacted. Unemployment rates were relatively low and almost identical, indicating that various pieces of legislation could be presented to give opportunities for everyone working within DC, as well as the surrounding areas impacted by its presence. But there's one big problem here, and it's an obstacle that's political as much as it is economical. DC would need more autonomy. Without being a state, the people of DC can't have representation, and with no real power to independently move without congressional approval, it's insanely hard to make lasting changes. Dozens of efforts have been made to amend the Constitution recommendation for more regional flexibility, but only 2 proposals have actually reached Congress, and of those 2, neither has passed the Senate. It's a complicated issue to say the least. Of course, the intricacies of various political interests is not our specialty here, but sometimes the economic consequences are unavoidable. In an almost poetic way, the capital of the world's largest economy is almost a distilled representation of everything that economy gets right and everything it gets wrong. It's incredibly wealthy and powerful, but it has real issues that are difficult to address and made even harder by a long list of technicalities. Okay, now it's time to put Washington DC on the Economics Explained leaderboard to see how it stacks up against the states that it represents and entire national economies. Starting as always with size, the DC area has a GDP of $145 billion US. This would be much larger if it included the surrounding metro area, but this is the best estimate of the output within the technical borders of the district. Even still, that gives this one small area a similarly sized economic output to the nations of Morocco and Slovakia, and it gets a 6 out of 10. GDP per capita, as we've already explored thoroughly in this video, is absolutely world-leading, outmatching every country in the world, including Monaco, which cheats in the same way and is famous for its wealth. DC gets a 10 out of 10. Stability and confidence is the same. It's the national capital of the largest economy in the world, and despite its local issues, it's not going anywhere unless something goes seriously wrong in the global economy. 10 out of 10. Growth has actually been pretty strong, although perhaps unsurprisingly, it's right in line with the national average of the USA, which makes sense given how much of DC's economy is dependent on governing the wider economy. That being said, US growth has been remarkable by global standards, especially for an advanced economy, so by extension, DC gets an 8 out of 10. Industry is obviously very strong and highly technical. Now, would a lot of these law firms, think tanks, scholars, corporate offices, and government headquarters exist if this wasn't the place where political decisions get made? Almost certainly not. But luckily for DC, it is. It only loses a few points because its industries are technically not that large, and exports mainly come in the form of political decisions. It gets a 7 out of 10. Altogether, that gives the
What is that going to be altogether? Like a 8.0 or something?
District of Columbia an 8.2 out of 10, putting it basically right in the middle here on the state leaderboard and up here on the national leaderboard. If you want to find out how California did so well despite its own extremely long list of pressing challenges, you should be able to click to that video on your screen.
I'm sure because of Silicon Valley and Hollywood, LA area. Great video, as always. Love y'all. Hope everyone's doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below, any answers to any questions I had, any comments at all. And hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye. Hit all the buttons, the good ones. See you guys.